3. Welcome back, everyone, to Dungeon Brew. Today, John and I are continuing our series where we talk about genres that you would build your world upon. We're going to be talking about
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
magic. Stay tuned. Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about high fantasy as a genre. We've been doing a series now talking about
Yeah, we did.
No, we haven't even talked about low fantasy yet. This we have. Low fantasy, high fantasy. What have we been talking about? There's been like a dozen different genres we covered, and today we're going to be talking about high magic. John, why don't you give us a definition of this
similar
genre?
To high fantasy, except that we are talking specifically about how magic is being interwoven into the world. And it goes through every aspect that you can think of when it comes to what parts of the world are important, whether that's the creation. It has to do with maybe the geography, so that you have like sections of the world that are affected by magic in unique ways, that you go here and it's like this, there's illusion magic that isn't the desert of illusions and things like that, or the mountains that you always get lost in because it's just a maze and it's infected by some kind of magic. Like, magic is part of the world itself. And more than that, magic becomes a part of the people. It becomes part of their everyday lives. It's assumed that magic is just there. It almost becomes like technology in our own world. Different people may have access to different levels of magic, but at the highest levels, it is definitely something that there are people who could not live without it, and if it were taken away from them, they wouldn't know how to live in the world in general.
Yeah, and when you're thinking about creating a world like this as a dungeon master, a game master, it works in the same way as what we were talking about in the high fantasy. There's so many different aspects that you have to think about how to interweave magic as being the norm for the cities that they're walking through the landscapes, when they're talking with people. Folks recognize magic as being something that just simply exists. It's, again, that fabric of the world around them in which they engage and which constantly impacts
the other ones we're
and affects
talking
their
about when we get into this high-low area or other areas. There is a sliding scale of how much magic is high magic and how much is low magic, which we'll talk about low magic in the next video. But in terms of high magic, generally speaking, your high magic type campaign settings or worlds are going to be higher in frequency or higher in power, or both. So it might be a situation where everybody has just objects in their home that are magical. It is common that, you walk into somebody's house, kind of a Harry Potter-esque type thing where, people have wands and they're using them to do things constantly because magic is part of the fabric of the world. It might be something where if it's high power, not everybody has access to magic, but the people who do are on the upper echelon, and the things that they can do change the fabric of reality, and they can do that in such ways that it changes the way that the world experiences reality.
I have a tangent I want to jump off in later, but I won't go there quite yet. Okay. So stay tuned for that little piece of advice. But one of the things that I oftentimes think about in creating a world where magic is popular is really about city life and the governance of a city. You may have laws about magic, what can be cast. You might have to have a license that you need in order to utilize it or to explore certain schools of magic within the city limits. And just like you're saying, how you may walk into a home and find natural magical objects, you may also find things in the city that are managed by magic, or that have some sort of I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head and nothing's coming to mind, but where you have to engage with certain things through the use of magic in order to make them accessible or
and you can
useful
get creative
that
with
city
this too.
environment.
I mean, think about modern comforts that we have when it comes to magic. That could be public transportation of some kind. It could be things where you have access to just cleaning, like you have street cleaners that are magical golems that just walk up and down the streets and make sure that everything stays tidy. There's really no limit to the things that magic can do, because magic is, in and of its nature, something that is supposed to answer issues of living. I think that the other things to think about are the effects of magic and what this type of magic can do. And again, we can look at our own world where technology provides answers for things like having enough food to go around, having safety, having security. Magic should be providing answers to that. So a high magic world is most likely going to have a higher population. It's most likely going to be able to solve issues of diseases or poisons and things like that, which again, in our own society, we have eradicated or close to eradicated a number of diseases that were very debilitating to the human race for a very long time, which is why in the last century or so we've seen this huge incline in our population, because we no longer have to deal with that. We see a huge incline in the population because we don't have to worry about food in a lot of first world countries anymore. And even though it's an issue in other cultures and other parts of the world, the access to food and the access to health care that we have now is nowhere near where it was 1,000 years ago because of that. Think about magic in those ways. What problems can it solve for society?
Yeah, and how does that impact the critical thinking or the technology overall within your world? I mean, summarizing some of what you're saying, if you have a druid that can just make food for your population and create, a farmer's bounty with a snap of his fingers, what is that? Why would you ever invent a plow or invent other types of technology that might help you improve your farming? Do you really have medical centers if a cleric can just heal any ailment that comes along and that magic's available for the population? I mean, this solves a lot of issues within that world that we may be familiar with, but they may not have pursued looking for other advances or other solutions because they have
that's
magic
an interesting
available at their fingertips.
rabbit hole to kind of go down too, because if there is an uneven distribution of magical access for certain cultures or certain peoples, there may be people who are definitely doing what you're talking about. They have clerics or druids or whatever who can solve the ills of that nation. In other nations where they don't have access to magic, maybe technology is flourishing. Maybe they are the ones who are developing things like firearms and other things because they don't have magic and they have to have something that can counteract the effects or replicate the effects that magic has in other areas of the world. Yeah.
So the little nugget that I kind of want to slip in here, and we can play with this concept some, John, but in our own world, in terms of magic being something or living in a low magic world, that conceptualization of magic in our own world has shifted throughout the ages. If we look back to times of antiquity, there was what we would consider high magic. It was ceremonial procedures that happened typically from Judeo-Christian that later influenced Eastern nations on how they engaged with their gods, with religion, how they perceived the cosmos and the construction of the world. And they had various ceremonial practices they did by going to the tabernacle, burning certain incenses, offering certain prayers, certain hymns to their gods in order to provide them whatever comforts they think that came from that or whatever blessings came from that. As technology has progressed, there's been a shift in how those perceptions have kind of come out and how we see the world. And I would say that we probably don't have as much of a supernatural or a magical perception for many people on what the answers or the solutions are for those things around the cosmos and religion and belief systems. But high magic is usually very ceremonial in practice. It has a lot of these specific pieces in a high magic fantasy world that you could apply in your own gameplay, where low magic doesn't necessarily have those same ceremonial pieces.
I think that probably depends, honestly, and I think it depends usually on how the GM chooses how to represent magic in the world, right? I think, and we can talk about this maybe more in low magic, but in low magic, you might have the ceremonies, but there's no result. There is the ceremony, and at the end of the ceremony, it's left to your imaginations whether or not these things work. In high magic, you're going to have you may have the same rituals and ceremonies, but it should have more of a technological feel where it's like there is a direct cause and effect. It is very visible that what they are doing in this ritual results in something at the end of it. That is something that is necessary in high magic, that there is a sense of it having a reason to exist. Otherwise, technology would eventually take it over in the same way it has in our world, because the magic wasn't doing anything. There were promises that, this stone is luck and it will do all these great things for your household, and you take home the stone and then nothing happens and you are destitute and poor. And so then magic doesn't necessarily have the same effect all the time.
Yeah, it would be my position that in a high magic society like you're talking about, and the ceremonial magic that you do has a direct impact on the soul, on the essence of being, because it's so interwoven within the existence of the universe or the cosmos or the plane or the reality of itself. And in a high magic world, you see magic kind of thrown in there. And we'll talk probably about this more in low magic. But in low magic, it doesn't necessarily have a direct impact on the soul or the spirit or the essence of being. It's more of like, it's going to bring you love or good luck or something that is maybe more folkish in nature, instead of being something that's really deep-seated within the existence
and I
of the
think it's an
universe or
interesting
reality
thing to consider, because like I said, it's kind of up to the GM on, you can have the same events in the same scenario, but usually the way that it comes across is provided through nuance and provided by the results. But in general, I think that thematically there are a number of things that you can consider if you're looking at a high magic style campaign, which is usually along the same lines as questions that you would have in like a high technology style campaign, which is magic good or bad? There is a question of, does magic do good things for the world, or does it do bad things? And there should be evidence to both ends. The same way there is in our world. Is technology a good thing or is it a bad thing? Well, it does all these things, food for people, the higher population, less likelihood of starving, less disease. But then you also have the bad things that come with it, where you have oil spills that kill, fish, and we're destroying environments, all this other stuff. So there's kind of this back and forth of, is magic good? Is magic bad? Is technology good? Is technology bad? And thematically, in this type of environment, you can really explore that in interesting ways.
Yeah, I'd agree. And another thing you might want to consider, too, is how warfare looks differently in this setting as opposed to other ones. When you have a field full of mages that are throwing fireballs and dropping lightning, it's going to be a much... you're going to have defenses for that. You're going to have to approach it differently. You're going to have a whole different structural idea about how to engage in combat when it's so destructive, or it can be so destructive. Or maybe it's mind-altering magic where you can completely take control of opposing forces coming at you and have them turn on their own. There's things that you have to think about in terms of defenses and different ways of approaching that for your players in the course of the campaign. It's not where you're jumping into a modern world.
Right. And I think that's a very interesting option for exploring military and warfare is again, looking at technology. We have drones. We might have boots on the ground, but we do use drones. Golems are a great answer to that. Or if you're looking at a campaign setting such as Eberron, where you have the Warforged, you wouldn't necessarily need to field soldiers if you can have an army of golems going and doing your work for you. What does warfare look like? It probably doesn't look like anything that we would be familiar with in our own, medieval times, and it would probably be closer to modern warfare than anything else. It's guerrilla tactics, because you don't want to be standing in regimented lines and going and marching onto a field if you've got wizards casting fireballs at you from the other side. It's just going to be a bloodbath. It doesn't make sense to engage in warfare in that way. It would be something that looks entirely different.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of other things. We sometimes add in some pieces about genre themes or even inspirations that people can draw on if they want to go and build a world that's similar to this. Anything off the top of your head in terms of high magic settings that they might draw on for inspiration in trying to build their own world?
D&D style campaign settings are high magic. Forgotten Realms is high magic. Dragonlance is high magic. I mentioned Eberron. Eberron is kind of a mix because it also has some post-apocalyptic stuff thrown in there. In terms of literature, I would think that Harry Potter again is high magic. When you're within the wizarding world, they rely on it. It is part of the fabric of their reality. And I'm struggling to think of ones that are beyond this, but those are generally the ones that most people are probably going to be familiar with. And I want to contrast that with some low magic settings to kind of give some idea, but we'll talk more about this. Lord of the Rings really is something of a low magic setting. You don't have a lot of wizards running around. The magic is very subtle. Things that elves do is considered to be magical, but there's not really this kind of like in-your-face flair. And even Gandalf's magic is very reserved and not seen very often. It's not the kind of thing that happens all the time. The most powerful magic that you ever really see him cast is something close to a fireball. It doesn't get much beyond that. So it's interesting to try and think of those things. And then Game of Thrones is another one that's very low magic. There's really not much magic to speak of, and most of it is subject to is this real or was it something else in a lot of cases, or it's kind of falls into that low fantasy, low magic type thing where it's almost supernatural more than anything else.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I have a whole lot of examples that come to mind in thinking of low magic, and high magic I think is just so expected when I come into gameplay that I don't usually look for areas of inspiration from that. But I'll share my low magic.
That sounds good. It's really something that you can find kind of across the gamut when it comes to CRPGs and that type of thing. The Pathfinder games that came out, and the Baldur's Gate games, obviously from back in the day, which are based off of Forgotten Realms. Many of the new ones, like Divinity: Original Sin, is still considered high magic. It is, like you said, it is an expected trope oftentimes in fantasy that magic is something that is very exciting and unique. And then when it comes to low magic, we're getting a lot more of those, I think, nowadays. So they're a little bit more readily available in terms of what does this look like.
That may be another video for us to do sometime, is talking about how the tropes of fantasy have swayed on this pendulum back and forth through the last 30 to 50 years, because it is definitely
it's
something that we can examine
sword and sorcery
and
the funhouse dungeons that used to exist way back in the day, and then the swing towards dark fantasy, and I think it would be very interesting to look at.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you guys so much for hanging out with us, unless you had something else, John. All right, so please hit the subscribe button, and
Jon